Wow, what a hard discussion to follow. But what I hope to talk about in the next 30 minutes is to start a conversation on some of the actual tools that might bridge this gap with what policymakers can actually use and already take as a framework for action from complexity. And just to explain, I am not a complexity scientist, and actually my introduction into this field, well, actually came from the field. In 2001, I joined a small Israeli think tank that was really running all the back-channel negotiations between Israelis and the Palestinians and some others. And it was actually started by the people who started the whole Oslo process, and in effect, it became the hub, the informal hub between all the players, and really any real paper, agreement, ideas that was later formalized was created within this informal hub. Unfortunately, I joined when the party was over in 2001, and everything was falling apart. So you had this process that was building up for 9 years, and there was an understanding on all sides that the actual agreement is an obvious one, and that's the attractor in the system, and everything is leading that way, and then it starts to fall apart. So we were running around like crazy, trying to make sense of things, trying to find frameworks that could actually help us navigate this crisis management. And of course, complexity in systems started to figure in terms of how we were starting to analyze all of these things and manage them on a day-to-day basis. And then a couple of years later, I started to work on issues of international missions. There was an idea of actually putting together an international mission on the ground in the West Bank, which got me to work on all the military side. This was derailed mainly because of Iraq, I would say, that kind of took all the attention away. But I was then invited to join a small internal military think tank that was using complexity theories to really reinvent and reconceptualize military operational design in a whole new way. And I think that that is where I really learned about complexity in its really applied side, and they developed some really interesting things with interesting repercussions that then were embedded into other militaries across the world. So what I'd like to share with you really is some of those lessons and really the kind of experimentation I'm doing based on some of these tools to take them into new realms of other issues and other challenges that can be dealt with as well. But just to start off, I think it's important to talk about another issue that, again, resonated throughout these days and also in Foresight sessions, which is all about the need to reframe the role of government. So, as we said, traditionally until today, the main political debate in terms of what the role of the government actually is was all about the commanding heights, was all about, is it the government, is it the market? And that came with real obvious government machinery, which was very industrial, all built around these cogs and silos. So you had different departments doing different things. They were connected, but they were working completely differently. And of course, the government itself was evaluated on its ability to manage the national growth, which is, of course, is very easy. All you need to do is ask the economists, the oracles of our times. They will tell you what to do. If it doesn't work, you can go back to them again, and they'll tell you why it didn't work, and you have a whole narrative that you can put forward. But what is interesting that over the last few years, especially when you talk to politicians, when you talk to people within government, you actually see that there is a realization that the actual role of the government has changed. They realize that they now need to navigate a social ecology, that everything is interdependent, that they're trying to do something in one place and it has huge ramifications in another. If they want to change certain economic situations, they need to take on cultural issues, technological issues, organizational issues, etc. And that comes together with an understanding that if it is a social ecology, of course you can't manage it, you can't design it. The only thing you can actually do is intervene in a way that will either accelerate certain trends and certain dynamics or undermine certain patterns that are emerging within that system. So really, you can rethink about the role of the government as promoting the well-being of the social ecosphere. So even though you can't control and design it, you can promote it through these different interventions. The problem is that the government machinery stayed the old cogs and silos. And this is where you have an unsustainable tension. And this is why I think that the government machinery is going to transform in the near future. And it could either be transformed in a way that we promote and work on, or it will collapse. So I think that this is really one of the key challenges that, of course, underlies this conference itself. But one thing that hasn't changed is the role of the government, the operational role of the government as a fixer. The government is not an entrepreneur. The government fixes problems. So the government really deals with issues and problems that are brought to him from various places. And that requires us to also rethink the issue of power, because we tend to think about power as embedded with the agent that is holding the position, that is formally in charge of something. But actually, when you look at the real leverage, the real room of maneuver of the actual decision makers, it is so much more constrained. And all of these constraints build over time as issues develop. So from media to commitments, to information flows, to ongoing crisis, to what other leaders are doing, all of these things are creating so many growing constraints within the system that actually by the time the memo gets to the desk of President Obama, it's too late. So really you think about this person who is the most powerful person in the world, and actually when you see the kind of leverage and maneuver that he actually has in specific decisions that he can make, it is so constrained. And the saddest thing is to find out that you made it finally to the right room with the right decision maker, with the right idea, and he actually tells you, yeah, that's a good idea, but I can't do anything about it. So really, there is an element of the need to intervene in that much earlier upstream area of government making. And in that sense, what we also need to think about is, what do these decision makers actually need? And the key question here is, again, going back to what is the government in the system, who is the agent, and what is the system? So what kind of help are we providing policymakers? And there are really two approaches. The first is the analytic. So we write policy papers, and we provide various commissioned reviews and various examples that really look at a problem. They analyze the problem. They can use complexity frameworks to analyze it, to make sense of it, and then give various policy prescriptions. Just to give you an example, you can think about another global phenomenon that I found really interesting, which is the crisis of the middle classes. And I think some of that was mentioned as a potential today as well. So from Tel Aviv to Buenos Aires to London to Istanbul, not to mention the Arab Spring, you see all of these protests emerging. And what is interesting that it's not the poor masses, and it's not the ideological fringes and movements that are actually the ones that are initiating these protests. It is the educated. It is actually the ones that do have jobs that are really, really anxious and are really, really frustrated with what they feel the government is going to continue to provide to them and how their environment is changing. So if you were to use a complexity lens to really look at it and really analyze it as a system and analyze it as a dynamic, you could actually kind of provide an overview of all the multiple layers of different tensions and trends that have been building up in the system. And actually, they've been building up in the system for the last 30 or 40 years, if not more. So you have multi-layers of different, very deep kind of structural ruptures. You have key emerging trends. And then you have the obvious tipping points, which is what brought it really to the fore. It is the final stage of manifestation around food, fuel, and finance. And unfortunately, we don't have time to actually deal with this, but if anyone is interested, I'm happy to discuss that further. But while products like these give interesting and really, if you like, almost holistic perspectives of a given phenomenon, they are good as a background information kind of thing, but they are not what a decision maker actually needs when they need to make a decision. And that is because they lack the specific context of the problem that the decision maker was faced with when he had to take this issue on. Which brings us to the other perspective. So the other route is the strategic, which actually means inside looking out. So take, for example, a different phenomenon. Across the UK, you have a problem of the declining high streets. So you have all of these commercial centers in towns. They're traditional high streets, which was the vibrant center of not only the local economy, but the community at large. And you have this trend of these hubs just gradually dying out. And you have places with 30, 40, and even 60% of the shops closing down. And of course, you have these dynamics. So when some of the shops close down, you have less footfall. You have less footfall. Other shops suffer. So you have this cascading effect. And what happens within that void, the social void that is created in these places, either you have different kind of shops that are opening, so betting shops and pawn shops, or they become this kind of empty space, and we know that empty space would be obviously populated by other agents in the area, and vandalism, that kind of thing. The key issue here that while we can understand the phenomenon and we can analyze it again as a complex problem, it means different things as a problem if you're part of the local council, if you're part of the police, or if you're sitting in number 10 and actually needs to manage that as a national governmental level. So really, when you start to develop the actual tools that policymakers need, you need to start to analyze the problem space from the specific perspective of the decision maker. And what I'd like to share with you is just an example of one process that you can use for that. And again, this draws on some of the ideas from systemic operational design, which was the military version developed by Shimonove and Orit. So really, stage one, you analyze the problem space as a holistic dynamic system, again, from the unique perspective of the decision maker. That means that what you're actually modeling is his or her problem, which also means that the model itself, the system that you're actually describing, is not something that represents the reality that everyone experiences. It just represents all of the different forces that make up the problem for the specific person who actually needs to come up with ideas and actions that they're going to implement. And that distinction is very important to do. So you really want to create a kind of understanding of what the system looks from his perspective, and that requires incorporating information from other sources and other studies that have been done, but really look at the dynamics. And here the main question that follows through is what changed? So what changed in the system today that created the specific context that brought this to your table as a hot potato to deal with? And here I'd like to take just a short detour to talk about the issue of coherency, because it is very important in terms of how you understand that system. I think Peter Ho also talked a lot about the issue of retrospective coherency. So of course, reality is multidimensional coherency. Any phenomenon that you can look at will always have a conceptual, a cultural, a social, a political, an economic, a technological, organizational element to it. No phenomenon is merely economic or merely technological, and all of these things fit together. And we're so used to finding that coherency that we usually don't really think about it. And if you think of wonderful shows like Star Trek, I'm not sure how many Trekkies are in the room, but yes. But the real genius of this show, which was a series of different shows, really is in the coherency. It had this richness of culture and history and economics and technology. And if there was a battle between the Klingons and the Romulans 500 years ago, it will still affect, you know, a completely different episode 7 years later. So you could really make sense of that together, and you can even go online and study Klingon. So the whole language, all of these things fit together. Now, the danger with not thinking enough about coherency is the fact that we tend to, and you see that again a lot with decision makers, you tend to equate it with certainty. So there's this idea that because in retrospect, I can now make sense of how things changed, how things failed, how things succeeded. That is the only way it could have happened. It's inevitable. But actually, it could have turned out in so many different ways. And if we had parallel universe, we would have seen potentially how it actually changed in other places. So we really need to differentiate between what we see as a certainty of something that happened and the inevitability that it had to happen that way. Now, of course, the future is incoherent by definition. That is, of course, because we don't have enough knowledge, because there is chaos and uncertainty as a natural factor inside it, but also because there are emerging tensions. Things haven't really worked out yet. There are all of these different patterns and different dynamics leading into different directions, and we don't know how it's all going to play out. From a strategic perspective, this is what we're looking for, because emerging tensions is where you can actually act and intervene to impact the system. So from a strategic perspective, what you are actually trying to do through action is intervene in such a system and try to push it in the direction of some coherency. Of course, uncertainty, you can't always manage it, but you can try to intervene towards a certain vision, towards a certain goal. Which takes us back to the process itself. So we've analyzed the system, we've looked at the specific context, we've done a lot of analysis of all the different shifts and trends that are emerging and how they interact. And what we're really looking for in terms of strategic potential emerges from those interactions and tensions between the trends, again, across all the different dimensions, and that is extremely important. And really, in terms of potential, there are two sources of potential. One is convergence of trends. So where we see things beginning to converge and create some logic. And perhaps a good example is what happens when we don't find that. So think about innovations that seem to have preceded their time, that kind of tragedy. It's because the permissive environment for those products was not there yet. So, think about the first actual iPad that was developed by Microsoft. Now, I don't know if it was a good gadget or a rubbish one, but definitely a lot of the other elements from a cultural, behavioral, infrastructure, economic element that were there when the actual iPad was launched did not exist back at that time, and that really, I think, was part of the failure. So that coherent permissive environment needs to be in place. Another strategic potential is always unsustainable tensions. So the fact that you can actually see things colliding, and you know that they're going to crash at some point. This is another potential that you're looking in a complex system that you can take advantage of. So, think about Source and the Pound and similar examples. So really, the strategy itself is a viable framework for action. What you're looking for is to find ideas for actions that will really take advantage of all of these dynamics that you've identified and will resonate into different directions, that will resonate into different elements throughout the system. And I was actually struck, I don't know how many of you were at a talk that was given about the Finnish case study of Citra. So you had this idea of a fund wanting to support something around sustainability, so they built a building block, which was sustainable. Now that sounds really, really simple. They wanted sustainability, they built a sustainable house. But actually, through that project, they impacted that system in so many different ways, in terms of regulation, in terms of smart materials, and in terms of norms, and in terms of culture of housing and spatial design, and so many other things. And that is the real, I think, wonderful potential when you actually think about strategy, but think about how it's going to resonate in all directions. So the end result of the strategy could be something really simple. It doesn't look complex, but the logic behind it and the kind of impact that you're trying to create in the system is. Similarly, you can think about Andrew Marshall and the other Star Wars. And again, simple idea that resonated on so many levels. So really, the objective of the strategy is creating systemic effects. It's not about creating end states, because of course, within a complex environment, you cannot create end states. Next phase is, again, critical thinking and recalibration. And what you need to analyze is the opposition system. Because if you're going to operate in a dynamic system, obviously it's going to create a lot of feedback, and you need to try and anticipate some of that, and you need to try to analyze some of the opposition forces that are going to work against you. Now, there are three kinds of oppositions that you can find within a dynamic system. The obvious one is the spoiler, so we can always, name the names of the bad guys, but it's actually not as simple as that, because it's not about individual agents or a group of agents. It's really about a system. So for example, trying to promote an Israeli-Palestinian agreement, the settlers movement is an obvious spoiler, but the settlers movement is not a group of people. It is not, 5 names that I can put on a list, but it's actually a much bigger system that relates to welfare processes, that relates to property regulation, that relates to community cultures, that relates to intergenerational tensions, that relates to links with evangelicals in the US, that relates to so many other things. So you really need to conceptualize the spoilers as a system, and then try to think about how you disrupt that system. Another source of opposition is, of course, the inertia itself. So when what you're really trying to do is systemic change. So you're really trying to take the problem system and shift it into another attractor. And of course, if you don't create that critical mass, if you don't reach that threshold, then what you're going to get is a huge backlash, which might actually shift you to a completely different phase. So that is another thing to think about. And the last one, which is usually the one that is ignored, is emergent opposition as opportunism. Because every time you actually act within the system, there will be unintended consequences. And these consequences create new resources, new niches within that environment. That means that agents that were previously on the sidelines, they couldn't care one way or the other, suddenly get vested interest in preventing things to move forward. So really trying to understand where those niches could emerge, and again, in conflict zones, this is all about conflict economics. You see all of these niches of activities, and suddenly you can make money in different ways. And actually, participating in conflict is a kind of a job with certain levels of security that you can do on an ongoing basis, and resources, and even, just NGOs coming into a zone with loads of money and resources. All of these things change the dynamics and actually could create opportunistic opposition. So again, this is a very important part, not only to rethink the strategy you came up with, but also as a preparation for the final part, which is the actual implementation. Because remember, this is all about taking action. So the final implementation also needs to change. We need to rethink how that is really being done. Traditionally, there was a division of labor. You would have policy making, and you will have the ones that are implementing, and then they'll come back 6 months later and tell you how it worked out. But actually, when you operate in a dynamic system, you need to blur those boundaries, because the only way you can really create impact is through iterative action. So iterative action is all about learning through praxis. So you do something, the system changes, you walk away, you need to make sense again of what has happened, and you need to adapt your action. That means that at the design level, you already need to think about how that learning process is going to actually work. What are going to be the information flows? And here you can think about and actually design programs around big data that you're going to use, outcome harvesting, if you're going to use action research with local communities in order to get a sense of what actually happened. You did something in the system, now you need to find out what did that actually do and rethink what you're actually doing. It also changes hierarchies, because when you have a learning process, who is going to receive the information, who is going to have the authority to change the action, to change the direction kind of in midair, how is all of that going to work? That also means that those authorities and that power needs to be closer to the ground than the top, and that creates a whole lot of other challenges with existing organizational machinery. But overall, again, the process of implementation is, of course, act, assess, respond until you think you might have created the actual impact that you were hoping for. So overall, I would say that the potential advantage of using such approaches is that you do get a higher fit and you do get greater impact just by the sheer element of all of the synthesis that you've done and an understanding of all of the dynamics on all of the possible fronts. There's also another interesting element, which is a higher level of creativity. You come up with more creative solutions. And that is because the process itself, which is quite rigorous and is constantly about reflecting and criticizing your own assumptions, leads you to find better ones. And of course, creativity is basically defined by losing your previous assumptions and finding new views of looking at things. So that's on the good part. The difficulties are around the need for, again, organizational change and training. These are very intensive and rigorous processes. And one of the key elements that I found that is very hard to get is the attention span that you need. So within militaries, they would close people in a room for 2 weeks. In other places, that's a bit harder to do. And the psychology of it is also difficult as well, because you constantly hit walls that you need to get over, and usually in corporate and in other environments, you hit a wall, so you come up with some solution, then you move on. And this need to actually get beyond those walls is extremely important. So it's a bit of a painful process. But I think it does hold a lot of potential. And again, there are many other developing tools that could be put in this similar toolbox. So overall, if I would conclude, I would say that from my perspective, applied complexity does hold huge potential for decision makers. It provides both new ways to make sense of the world, and it provides them new means to impact the world. And I think that, again, we're talking about research programs. If we could really put more research and experimentation into developing those tools, I think we can be really beneficial in a practical way. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. You're in time. Beautiful. Questions, answers. Please, Douglas.
So I think this is a difficult question. As complexity thinkers working for clients, helping them to be more competitive, do we have a social responsibility to the outcome that in increasing competitive capacity, we're also creating losers? That is, people who lose out in the competition. And from a systems point of view, those people are also part of the system.
Okay, well, that's, I think that anyone who helps with any process and strategy could say there could be, repercussions, and what is my responsibility for that. So that relates to any action, not just to complexity ones. But my personal view is that the more elements you incorporate into your thinking, and the fact that you do need to take under consideration cultural issues and resource issues and technologies, and so many of them, it makes the final decisions more ethical. in a way because they correspond to many more concerns and much wider concerns and much more long-term concerns in an environment. So generally, I would try to promote that thinking amongst my rivals as well as my friends.
But Douglas I think his question is coming from this, and you have two positions, two stances. One is the analytical one. Mm-hmm. Scientists feel safe with that, throw it over the fence, looking outside to the others and saying, hey, I'm seeing this in your situation, and I'm going to publish it, and that's it. Mm-hmm. An innocent bystander. And a scientific innocent bystander. But in the second one, you're choosing the perspective of the decision maker. Mm-hmm. And I think from that is his point coming. And when you're doing that, there exist wrong decision makers, something like that.
Of course. I mean, there are always wrong decisions. But I would actually say that I don't think that the scientific guy is actually really free of any responsibility. Yeah. It really doesn't matter. You gave analytical advice that could have been taken to the fore and actually used. So in that sense, I don't really see the difference in terms of the repercussions.
Okay. Next one, please. Stefan.
I'm not sure if I need, but so you started out with a very fascinating reconception of the role of government, actually. Mm-hmm. And in a way that is actually, I would argue, for a government quite uncomfortable, mm-hmm. in the sense that you said that the government is only an influencer of a system and can only sort of accelerate certain existing mechanisms or decelerate them, mm-hmm. Which I guess philosophically is quite a challenge to the role of government as in the sense of sort of the shaper of the good life and the conception of an ideal of society and so on and so forth. So I was wondering if in that, and of course what you elaborate on is then a way of actually being very active in that and shaping a vision and a way towards a desired outcome. But I think your starting point is sort of putting government at sort of the margins and being redefining the role as only sort of an accelerator or decelerator of an existing social ecosystem, almost. What does that mean in your view for political leadership, for the conception of leadership and what we understand of that in a context of governance?
Well, I would argue on the word only, because it's not only, it's a huge element, and actually government in that perspective is taking on a much bigger role than before. And it more relates to the idea of stewardship that also came up throughout these conferences. But it's really about, if it is really about everything, then the way you can intervene in a complex system is really only by really intervening in those dynamics. It is difficult. I agree that it is difficult, and that is part of the shift that is happening, but that is also part of the shift that is happening with the government machinery that is falling apart. And I think that also requires a new conversation with the public on what the role is and what are the expectations and how do you expect things to intervene. And also elements of that are already happening in our lives, but they're not framed that way. So really when you think about this whole preemptive narrative, so when you think about the main issues that were kind of preemptively driven, climate change, terror, debt crisis, they're all about preemptive interventions. Governments are coming and saying, well, actually, we can't manage that, we can't control it, but we think that we can intervene in a way that might, change it in the long run. But because it hasn't been framed that way, it looks like kind of not taking responsibility, and actually having that conversation out there could really help that.
But still governments maintain the myth of being the fixer?
The role of the fixer, yes, so in terms of not initiating but dealing with problems. But the way you can deal with problems is not by creating end-state solutions, but in transforming the problems.
Okay. Next one. Is that you? No, other questions, remarks? Please.
I found this presentation very interesting because one of the things we have been struggling with in NTU is how to apply complexity to real-life problems such as governance. That's why this workshop. So this addresses the objective directly. I just want to ask the question, your experience with the Israeli think tank and the military, how receptive is government to this kind of approaches, and what sort of difficulties do you find?
Well, in terms of the think tank and working on the everyday work, everyone were very receptive because what you actually brought them were leverages that they could use and to create, islands of certainty and various other things. So on the practical side, where you didn't actually have to talk about the methodology, that worked great. In the military case, where it was all about the methodology and trying to bring that as a whole framework, that created a lot of problems. Language and complexity language, I think, was also mentioned yesterday. So you're basically unleashing all of this jargon on unsuspecting practitioners, and you have these cultural backlashes. And there was the problem of the overall, are we ready to relinger the self-belief that we're actually solving problems and creating end states? So when a military comes and says there are no decisive victories, people, not within the military, but at the political echelons, get really anxious about that. Which actually, well, to cut a long story short, it created huge, wonderful impacts in the system, and then a backlash, and then was shut down.
Okay, can I follow up with a question? There are many big egos in government and in the military who thinks that they have the experience and the know-how to integrate all that they have known and make good informed decisions. How do they take to somebody who tells them that you have not looked at the whole thing? There are these pictures to look at, these are these effects to look at. And what was it like? Because I expect that as we start to move into this area of complexity for governance, policy making, and so on, we will see some of these issues. We have lots of big egos in government too.
Big egos in the government. He thinks that there are big egos in the government.
So yeah, again, because the whole approach comes from the directive of the decision maker himself, so he's coming with an actual problem, then that helps in a way because you're providing him through this, he's providing himself. I mean, this is a facilitated process. It's not that I'm going to go and do all the analysis myself and bring it to him. That's another very important thing. It's a group process that is led by the decision maker. Then if that actually at the end of the day provides him better strategies, better ways to create impact, then that's great. But generally, I would try to start with the number twos and the lower echelons. I think that's a bigger potential.
You had a question. Last one.
Apologies, this isn't so much a question, but it's a request for a reflection. I think for me, this is an elegant restatement, in effect, of a scenario to strategy intervention, using a little bit of complexity language. Because I see, there's a notion of mapping the problem space from the situation of the client, and then mapping it from the situation of the context, looking back, looking forward, looking at coherence, looking at intervention. My challenge is, or my question I should think is, I see strategic decision-making in a corporate sense very different from policy-making in the public space. And the big difference for me is that in corporate spaces, you can get away without asking the question, who's responsible for a better future? But in the governmental space, you can't. And so what I want to know is, where does the normative sit in this process?
Okay, first of all, I have no idea how that works in the corporate world because what I've done is policy and NGOs, so that's my experience. In terms of the scenario, I don't know that tool. I'd love to learn more about it. What is possibly a difference here is that there are no different scenarios. Actually, you end up with one directive, and there are various reasons for that within the process that there's no time to discuss here. I think, again, the normative element comes from the synthesis. By the very fact that you need to take into consideration so many elements that relate to the people who are actually impacted by that, because you are thinking about direct and indirect effects, that creates, in my view, a more normative proposal at the end than if you would have done the traditional linear policymaking process.
Okay. Thank you very much for your nice presentation. Thank you very much.